Welcome back to our Wednesday night Bible study over the book of Daniel. This will be the 9th lesson that we've had, and we're going to be looking at the 8th chapter of Daniel. It's hard to believe that we've already covered so much of this book, yet there is still so much that remains in terms of prophecy and historical content within the book of Daniel, and I think you'll find it encouraging as I have studying through this book. Within Daniel chapter 1, we see the man of Daniel as a captive, stripped away from his homeland and now brought into the foreign land of Babylon. Daniel is true to his Jewish roots. He is not going to let a foreign nation or a foreign king, even though he's under their power, he's not going to let them take over who he is as an individual. We see a lot of great attributes of Daniel. He is steadfast, he's faithful to God, and he's resolved in his mind to not put God under any other king of this world. Though Nebuchadnezzar was rightfully one of the most powerful people in the world at this time, Daniel never submitted to him in place of God. Now, Daniel did follow the king's orders on a couple of instances as far as translating his dream or interpreting his dream. But Daniel knew from Daniel chapter 2, verse 21 and 22 from his own praise that God is the one who raises kings up and God is the one who lowers kings down. That God is the one who dictates all the seasons of this world. And we too can find comfort in that, because it seems like this world is crazy. And as crazy as it might seem, there's this beautiful orchestra that's taking place to deliver God's will. And we can always have confidence that God, no matter how crazy this world is steadfast and He is rock solid. So, we saw the man of Daniel in chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 2 through 6, we saw the ministry of Daniel. If you ask preachers some stories of their preaching career or of their ministry, I'm sure you'll find lots of stories. Ministers seem to have some of the finest stories around and some of the most interesting stories too. I've heard some real good ones, and I'll spare you the details for those. But certainly Daniel had some stories among his ministry in terms of interpreting the dreams of this crazy king, rising up to prominence, watching his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go through a fiery furnace, seeing handwriting on the wall that appeared before King Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5, being thrown into a lion's den in Daniel chapter 6 and surviving it, and then watching his oppressors also get thrown into that lion's den. And then Daniel chapter 7 starts this new break within the book of the message of Daniel. Last week we looked at Daniel 7, and this was the first vision that Daniel had seen. Now, all this time up to into the book of Daniel, Daniel has been interpreting others' dreams and others' handwriting. However, now is time for Daniel to have his own visions. And last week we looked at the vision of Daniel and how there were going to be these kings and kingdoms that would take place and run us into the first century persecution of the Christians. And this would all come by way of the Roman government. Now, when we look at Daniel chapter 8, which is still within this point of Daniel chapter 7 through 12, looking at the message of Daniel, we're going to find two different kind of figures or beasts within Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 gives us insight into, first, a ram standing on the bank of this location. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 3, it says, I, speaking from Daniel, raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the other came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. Notice how it leaves out eastward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Now, here's what's going to be the interpretation from the ram is simply the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, one great attribute of the book of Daniel is typically you get the interpretation right after the vision. So it leaves scholars very little room to kind of speculate what exactly is taking place. And the book of Daniel is masterfully written within Hebrew literature to give us precise timestamps along the way to figure out and identify what exactly the vision and the dream was speaking about. So we have this ram. It's got 2 horns. One horn is a little bit bigger than the other one. It's kind of an asymmetrical ram, and it's charging all over the world except for east. And it's got this great and mighty power. Now, if you remember your history from history class in school, history was my favorite subject. I did not like math, and maybe that's why I became a welder and a preacher. You use some math in welding, but it's all very primitive math. In preaching, everyone knows that preachers are horrible at math. But I loved history. If you remember, the Medo-Persians took over Babylon. So in the book before, we saw this great mighty ruler, Nebuchadnezzar, and after him was Belshazzar, and after Belshazzar was King Darius. But Darius was a Medo-Persian kind of influence. And so we see this great story take place from Babylon, who is this mighty great ruler, this kingdom of the earth that thinks that they are the bee's knees, and they get taken over by the Medo-Persians. Well, that is the ram, and this ram is going to have two different horns. We know from history class that Medo, that the area of Media, was the lesser of the two, and Persia would become the more pronounced, more great kingdom of the two. So perhaps that's what we're looking at here in Daniel chapter 8. And then in Daniel chapter 8, verse 5, it says, "As I was considering, behold, a male goat." So then we have the second character introduced into this vision, and that is the goat. And that's going to be Greece, or the Greeks. Notice what it says about the goat. "The goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes." So kind of an interesting image that you have in your mind, but certainly not too far-fetched of an image, especially after looking at Daniel chapter 7. "He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath." So this goat, the Greek, is angry at the Medo-Persians. And notice in verse 7, "I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and he struck him down, or struck the ram, and broke the two horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power." Notice a little key indicator of interpretation here that we're going to find within the book of Daniel. Though Daniel doesn't explicitly say this, we can deduce it from the text. Notice that the goat came after the ram, and what did the goat do? He broke the two horns on the ram. So horn, in a way, represents power. So we're going to find this terminology used throughout the book of Daniel, but also into the book of Revelation. So whenever we see horn, we see power. So when you look at verse 7, the two horns are broken, and the ram had no power to stand before him. And he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Verse 8, "Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of the heaven." So here what we have so far is the goat fights the ram, it wins against the ram, so the Greeks fight the Medo-Persians, win, and there's one conspicuous horn for the Greeks, and that would be none other than Alexander the Great. You don't have to look very far into history to realize that Alexander the Great was not called Alexander the Great for no reason, or that there were several towns and provinces called Alexandria, but simply the fact that Alexander was this mighty conqueror within the ancient world. However, he grew very prideful, and among his pride, he esteemed his people to worship him as a god. Of course, Achilles was his kind of role model, if you would. And looking after Achilles, he bought into this Greek mythology that we see used within literature of other places. And by this, Alexander the Great kind of grew prideful of himself and thought to himself, well, I ought to be worshipped as a god. Later, we see that he grew sick of a fever and he died in 323 BC. Now, here's what's interesting about that is when he died, he had two sons. His two sons were killed, and that led way to four different provinces. So the Greeks mainly ruled by Alexander. And then after Alexander, you have four different provinces or kingdoms that would rise up. So in the book of Daniel, it says basically that Alexander, after his death, would give way to four different conspicuous horns, and they would run toward the winds of the heaven. So here we have the Seleucus, so Seleucus, and then we have the Ptolemies, Ptolemy, and then you've got the Lysicamus, and then the Cassander. Now, these all came by the name of the Diadochi. Lots of weird names being tossed around here, but those are the 4 different kingdoms that would come after Alexander the Great and become the 4 winds of the earth. Now, if we keep on reading, in verse 9, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south. So, out of one of these 4, there was one who rose up to power greater than the other 3. Verse 10, it grew great even to the host of heaven. Now, here we have some interpretation that needs to take place. What is the host of heaven? Is it the angelic army? Is it God and his angels? Is it the stars that are in the sky in a literal sense? Well, when you keep on reading in the book of Daniel, when you jump down to verse 24, it kind of gives us a little spoiler alert. But the host of heaven are seen as the saints. So this great and mighty horn was great even to the host of heaven, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled them. When we look at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 3, we also see saints pictured in a glorified light in the sky. So the host of heaven, the stars, they were thrown down, and this one mighty horn from the 4 of these would trample and persecute the saints. Well, of course, this is pre-Christ, so Christ is not on the earth yet. So this would be the Jews. The Jews were seen as the saints in this time, just like Daniel. In verse 11, it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. The great offering, we would note from Exodus 29, that the priest had daily offerings to take place. And of course, through this, we see this great and mighty horn who is defiling the saints and persecuting the saints. He is also taking away the offering. So this is not a good picture that's taking place here. Verse 12, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. So this great horn is doing everything that it can to defy God, to defy God's people, and to defy God's law. Now, this mighty horn has a ton of power, but when we look in verse 12, why does it have power? Well, at this point in history, the Jews were doing so poorly within their doctrine, so poorly within who they were as Jewish people. They were latching onto man-made traditions. They were really putting God on the back seat and rising up for a name for themselves in prominence, and were growing prideful. Again, Daniel chapter 4, we realize that pride is a spiritual cancer. Alexander the Great, we realize that pride is a spiritual cancer. And here we go again. We see pride is a spiritual cancer among the saints, or those who were under God's law. And it says that all of this is taking place in verse 12 because of transgression. So, this great and mighty horn is going to come from one of these 4 winds, or one of these 4 kingdoms, and it's going to do all these things due to the people's transgression against God. God saw a perfect time of judgment to take place for these saints. Verse 13, then I heard a holy one. This is still Daniel seeing this vision. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Now, if you take that number, 2,300, it will translate to about 6. 6 years is going to be how long this is going to take place, which again, it's mind-boggling how great and how accurate the book of Daniel is, having been written near the 550 mark. Now, here's what's really awesome, is we can identify who this is from the Seleucus Empire. You bring it down here, and you have none other than Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, if you want to read more about this great persecutor of the Jews, Antiochus Epiphanes, then you can read books like 1 Maccabees. You get the entire history into what's going to take place with Antiochus Epiphanes. He rules from about 175 BC to 163 BC. However, you have his prominence really start showing up about 170 BC. That's when things are going to start taking place for Antiochus Epiphanes to become this great ruler. And it will run you down to about 163/164. And this can be seen as 170 to 169, kind of roughly. That's where you have this great horn of the Seleucid Empire rise up to prominence and start persecuting the saints. Now, if you do the math, 170 to 163, give or take 1 year, you have about 6 years. So 2,300 days then translates into 6 years. So that's how long that Antiochus Epiphanes will have dominion over the saints of the Jewish nation. Now, in 163 we have, or in 164, you have December 14th. Now, to us as Christians, and I'm running out of room over here, 164 BC, to us as Christians, that date may not be too significant. However, to the Jewish people, that is a very significant date. That's the reestablishment of the temple. That's when things are going to come back together. And here we find, in verse 14, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. When you look at history, guys like Judas Maccabeus are the ones, the culprits, of leading the Jewish people in this guerrilla warfare against Antiochus Epiphanes to have a reestablishment of the temple in this great feast that would be thrown. Again, when you look at Jewish heritage, this is a huge, significant date of the reestablishment of the temple. When we look at history too, we can find that Antiochus Epiphanes, within 1 Maccabees and also 2 Maccabees chapter 7, was defiling the temple, was taking away the offerings. He would go in the temple and burn pig stew, and then he would try and force other people to drink the pig stew in the temple, which was totally wrong and totally messed up in the Jewish mindset. And so this is the great persecutor that came out of the Seleucid Empire. Now, Daniel is so great because he's having this vision, he's recording it, and because he's recording it, he is then able to warn the people in the coming years, hey, this is going to happen and this is going to take place. Now, in verses 15 down through 26 of Daniel chapter 8, we get the interpretation of the dream. And I would encourage you to kind of run through that very briefly and to check all the different things that we've learned in Daniel chapter 1 through 14, or in Daniel chapter 8, 1 through 14. You see that the interpretation of the vision all takes place. But here's what's really awesome within the book of Daniel, as we have yet another figure that shows up in Daniel chapter 8. Verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Eula, and it called Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Now, Gabriel is really fascinating to us because he is considered to be one of the greater angels within the angelic army. When we look at Luke, and I'm trying to find room here, Luke chapter 1 and verse 19, we see Gabriel appear to Zechariah. And of course, we know the story of his appearance to Zechariah. And then when we look at 7 verses later, we look at Luke chapter 1 and verse 26, he also appears to Mary. Well, he's appeared to Zechariah, he's appeared to Mary, so he plays a significant part in the birth of Christ and also in the birth of John the Baptist. But also in part of that, he plays a huge role within the book of Daniel. Daniel being this man, this finite human being on the world, and has seen several different kingdoms come and go already, is now standing before Gabriel, like the Gabriel of the Bible. And Gabriel is now going to interpret the vision for Daniel, which I think is so mind-boggling and so awesome that he gets to be here before the presence of Gabriel and hear everything. Verse 17, so he came near where I stood, and when he came I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Now, again, time of the end, is it the end of the world? Well, some may see it that way, but when you look at the time of the end of Judaism, you're cutting it very close to this time century or this time point to the start of Christianity, or really the start of the followers of Christ. And when we look at passages like Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 30 and 31, we realize that God already has another day, another time frame coming. He says, in those days, behold, you see, God is looking forward to a certain time, a period that goes beyond the Jewish nation and the Jewish time period. Verse 18, it says, when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. but he touched me and made me stand up. Now, kind of an interesting verse. So Daniel, seeing Gabriel, I don't know why, perhaps it's because of fright, because he was scared, he fell into a deep sleep, and Gabriel kind of had to go over and touch him in order for Daniel to wake up. And not only did he wake up, he stood up. In verse 19, he said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the later end of the indignation." For it refers to the appointed time of the end. Verse 20, "As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." Now, how cool is that we get a interpretation built within the text? Verse 21, "And for the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king." So here we have the Greeks, and then you've got Alexander the Great. Verse 22, "As for the horn that was broken, in place of what the four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from that nation." So you've got our 4 kingdoms that we're going to look at also in Daniel chapter 11, "but not with his power." Verse 23, "And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king, a bold-faced one who understands riddles, shall arise." Verse 24, his power shall be great, but not by his own power. "And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy the mighty men and the people who are the saints." So when you have that word saints, verse 24, tie it back up to verse 10. "And some of the host and some of the stars he threw down to the ground and trampled on them." So here we have saints kind of connecting as far as what Antiochus Epiphanes is going to be doing. Verse 25, "By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken." So Antiochus Epiphanes thinks that he's so great that he's basically equal with God. That's what it means, the prince of princes. So there are many princes, but there's only one prince, which is God. There's no way of getting around that. And then you have Antiochus, who basically says, "I'm equal with God. I am God." Well, verse 25 says, "He shall be broken, but by no human hand." So you've got the Maccabean Revolt that takes place within this time period. Obviously, it is going to be a guerrilla warfare, and the odds are completely stacked against the Maccabees, but they are still able to overthrow this king. Verse 26, "The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." So how cool is that Daniel is seeing this vision that he'll never get to see in physical terms, but he gets to see it in spiritual terms, what's taking place. Verse 27, "And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it." So here we have in Daniel chapter 8 a great vision that's going to take place for the Jews, because it shows that there's going to be a time of trial. There's going to be a time of where you think that this world is coming to an end, where you have no more power, where you have no more faith. However, Antiochus Epiphanes, no matter how great he is and no matter what kind of genealogy you have there is still one true and mighty God. Now, Daniel had to seal everything up in a book because it was for the days that were later than him. Now, what I would give to see Daniel living in this time period, to see him experience all of this and tell the Jewish people, "Hey, don't worry about it. Like, this guy, he's just going to come and he'll be here for a little time, but then after those 6 years, he's going to be pushed away and gone, and God is still going to reign as king." Daniel chapter 2, verse 21 and 22. However, we get great insight as well because we realize, like, hey, no matter what this world throws our way, no matter what kings rise up, no matter what governments rise up, no matter what country is the most powerful country in the world, Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20 and 21, our citizenship is in heaven. And that's what Paul latched onto, even despite going into Roman prisons and eventually being killed by the Romans. So here we have a great encouragement found within Daniel chapter 8, and we find awesome history found within Daniel chapter 8. Hopefully you found that encouraging and maybe a little bit entertaining, looking at the ram and the goat and all that would take place. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you can be encouraged just as I am with Daniel chapter 8.